All right, hey, we're here to talk about inoculating the identity ecosystem against common attacks, which to a large extent means changing the ground rules for how we deal with identity security. And I'm Alex Weinert, I'm the Director of Identity Security for Microsoft.
And I am Pamela Dingle, I am the Director of Identity Standards. You like the symmetry there? And I also work in Microsoft.
All right.
So I am going to start off with a story about slow change. And this is really the story of Preston Pruneworth. So if you go onto Facebook, you will find that there's a jaunty little penguin named Preston Pruneworth who has a Facebook account. Unfortunately, Preston Pruneworth posts no longer because I lost all access to that account. And you would think that being an identity professional, that it might have been, my knowledge intellectually of how terrible passwords are that was the prompt for me to change my password hygiene. No, it was the little penguin. So I had terrible password hygiene in my personal life as much as I observed it very well in my professional life until I had this ridiculous life event happen and I lost access to this account. Turns out I thought my memory was great. I was very prickly about privacy, and so I didn't use my real date of birth, nor did I write down what I actually set. I used an email address that was completely separate from all my personal life, and I lost access to that. And then I forgot the password, and so I literally dug myself a hole for this silly little account. And this is what prompted me to find a password manager and start using a password manager. But what happened after that, when I started using a password manager, was that all of a sudden, all of the little messages that the identity world was sending, they started to sink in, right? I started to understand what a password spray was, and that my previous use of test 1, 2, 3, 4, as much as I thought nobody was going to ever attack me, what I didn't understand is that they were going to try test 1, 2, 3, 4 against a million different accounts, right? Those types of messages started to sink in, and I started to learn. And so I very slowly came to a personal hygiene that was actually very good, and of course, eventually went to passwordless. But it didn't happen the way that anyone would expect that it might.
Right. So you might at this point think this is a presentation about how Pam's prickly privacy practices got her pissed about Preston Pruneworth's password problems and prevented him from posting. However, we're actually really here to talk about change. So, wow, that was work. I'm going to talk about some change that happened fast. And so, in my background, my family's from South Texas, and some of them are still ranchers. And I grew up, every summer my dad would send me to go live with my cousins. And we would, the first time this happened, we would go out and we'd weed soybean fields, which you would not necessarily expect in Texas, but that's what we were doing. And the first time we got up at like 4 in the morning, got in the back of a pickup truck, and bounced out into open fields, and there were the weeding implements and the shovels and rakes and implements of destruction in the truck, and then about 4 of my cousins and I in the back of this pickup truck bouncing down the road. And my oldest cousin was driving, and the middle cousin reached down and grabbed all the tools and threw them out of the truck, and then he grabbed me by my belt and threw me out of the truck. And then he jumped out after me. And so that was, and it was all, there were berms for irrigation. It was a soft landing. And he knew I was never going to do it on my own, so he just did it for me. But the thing was that, like, for me, growing up in that culture, seatbelts did not seem that important to me. It just didn't seem like the most crucial thing. So if you fast forward to when I was a teenager, and my best friend, Kurt, which my kids will say every horrifying story about me will start with, Kurt and I were whatever. But my best friend, Kurt, and I were in his mom's car. I was in front, he was in back, and I was not wearing my seatbelt. Now, she was a formidable person. She worked for the Department of Public Safety, and she looked over at me. She said, "Put your seatbelt on." And I said, "No, ma'am, thank you, but I don't wear a seatbelt." And she said, "You wear a seatbelt in my car." So I reached over and I grabbed the seatbelt and I clicked it home. And at that moment, this was down in, it's actually not too far from here, down on Baptist Road, Glen Eagles. It was a winter, and there's windy roads through that area. And at that moment, we clicked in the seatbelt, an F-150 pickup truck came around the corner, slid out of its lane, hit us head on, knocked us clear off the road. We ended up about 200 feet off the road. The pickup truck was about 100 feet off the road, both of us throwing up steam from the radiators. And I was alive at that moment because I had clicked that seatbelt home. Now, from that day to this day, I always wear a seatbelt. But there were 3 things that created that change, that fast change, that were in place for that to happen, right? One thing that was in place for that to happen is that there had been legislation passed in the United States that put seatbelts in every single car, right? In 1966, we passed a law that all cars sold in the United States require a seatbelt. And so that was one thing that changed. The second thing that created change was that my friend's mom worked for the Department of Public Safety. So her job was in jeopardy if she was caught riding around with people in her car without a seatbelt, because her department was required. So she had a commercial incentive, a monetary incentive. And the third major force there was actually community, right? Because I was afraid to be not allowed to hang out with my friend, right? So this was an authority and it was a person that mattered to me. I wanted to be invited over for pizza, you know? So sometimes change can be fast, but those forces have to be in place to create that kind of systemic change.
Right, and so you might remember Alex Simons in his keynote. He begged people to use MFA. Do you remember that? He begged them at the end, right? Well, that's what we all are doing right now. We are all trying to somehow help people to help themselves, right? Including, you know, passwords in elevators, right? You probably remember the passwords are like underwear ad campaign that was out a little while ago, right? We're really trying hard.
All right, so we got posters in elevators. We've got the little cars, little fold-out cars on the lunch table, right? We're going to try to train people. Hey, please don't click on that mail. They're going to click on the mail, just to be clear. You've got like impassioned speeches at conferences saying, please turn on MFA. So much passion, right? And then there's the panels.
So many panels.
So many panels, right? All the panels, right? And then we even do this, right? Like, hey, now look, Sarah too. We brought 2 people bringing MFA. Okay.
Yes.
Right. So yes, multi-textile authentication. So we have some stats, right? Like back in 2018, I came up and I talked about turning on MFA. It's what I do every year. And so if you look at MFA adoption back then, it wasn't great. And so we look at MFA adoption now, and it's still not that great. But it's better. But if you look at the attack velocity, look at now some of this is detection's getting better. But if you look at like password spray, which doesn't penetrate unless you don't have MFA, right? And other bad hygiene problems, it's actually worse. So what does that tell us? It tells us that cat herding is hard, right? Cat herding is slow going. And one of the things that we have to recognize is that attack velocity and intensity right now is changing faster than user training is changing users. User behavior is not changing as fast as attacker behavior is changing.
Right. I mean, our work is not succeeding fast enough to actually get the change that we need.
Right. So the game here is to try to create a pit of success, right? How do we create a pit of success? So today, we're all sort of, in this situation where if we were going back to the the seatbelt, and I'm using passwords and seatbelts, seatbelt analogy, we'd say that for you to get a seatbelt security in your car, all you have to do is go down to the auto parts store, buy yourself a seatbelt, go to the hardware store, buy yourself a drill, right? Read some manuals, figure out how to weld supporting brackets into the back of your car, drill the holes, mount the seatbelt, and then you're fine. And then we wonder why nobody wears seatbelts, right? And we do the same, and today we have airbags and all that kind of ding, 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 right? So what do we look at in our model, right, is we say, hey, here's a cool system. It does about 20 protocols, 19 of which are insecure. It can do MFA, but it's not turned on, right? There's a bunch of settings to restrict admin permissions, but by default, we're going to give you everything, right? But if you are willing to put in the work, we are willing to wear the t-shirts, right? And you can build yourself up. We need to flip that model. We need to get to a place where there's a pit of success, and if you want to become insecure, you got to work and climb out of the pit of success. So that's all about creating systemic change.
Yes. So we think there's actually 3 ways that we all could work together to create this kind of systemic change. This is not new, right? But if we get more thoughtful about it, we could maybe move the needle. So the first one is regulation. The second one is commerce. And the third one is community.
All right, so we've seen all these things work in what I will call the outside world, the analog world, right? So we've seen, the seatbelts example. Think about like the bar exam or, legal requirements, those sorts of things that industries place on themselves. The National Society of Professional Engineers has certification for civil engineers, right? The partner mandate. I'm not going to do business with you unless, you can't be my vendor unless you act in certain responsible ways, right? The customer imperative, right? I'm going to give you a discount on your insurance if you will carry that little thing in your car that tells me that you're not speeding. Role modeling, right? We can lead by example. We see people doing things like sustainable packaging where the rest of the industry starts to say, oh, actually that's possible, not just possible, but profitable, right? And then next we have, individual action, right? We have the occasional inspirational leader who can kind of set a pace that lots of other people come together and build community around.
Right. So it's great that we have these examples from, I will say, the real world, which kind of implies that our world is not the real world, but our world is really important too. And there's some really great ideas happening right now and initiatives that actually I think we should call out and examine to see if there are things in there that we can use. So the first one is the Department of Homeland Security's Silicon Valley Innovation Program. So, and by the way, we are not authoritative for any of these, so we're going to talk about these, and we might make mistakes in how we describe them, so small disclaimer there. But the Department of Homeland Security has created a series of grants, right? And startups are able to apply for these grants. But the grants have been created in series. They've been created to guide these startups, and they come with strings attached. And the biggest string that is attached is that the startups all have to interoperate with each other, right? So they're not just giving money to get a business outcome. They are also giving money to foster interoperability. And the result is this cohort of really great, savvy companies that can now all talk to each other, right? So now it's something that those companies can advertise as a huge benefit of their product, right? And it just sort of came about almost like magic. The next one is Kintara consent receipts. If you know what a receipt is from the supermarket you know what a Kintara consent receipt is, right? So you consent to something online, and instead of it going into a black hole and you never remembering whatever happened again, you now get a receipt back that you can now negotiate if something goes wrong. Well, this is wonderful, right? This got created in the Kintara initiative, and they're now moving that to ISO. And if you're not familiar with ISO, it's the International Organization for Standardization. It is a global organization with legal implications. So in some countries, right, an ISO specification is darn close to law, if not law. So what they have done is they've incubated this standard in a small place, and now they're moving it towards that industry standard goal, right? And along the way, people are learning about it. And that whole idea of getting receipts for the consent that you've given is pretty cool, right?
All right. The Zero Trust Cybersecurity Executive Order, right, is a great example of a government legislative mandate. And if you think about the impact of this, so this is where lots of people collaborated. Like it started with our friends in GRU, building a large attack that got a lot of attention, went to the press, right? But we were able to actually leverage that to get federal attention at the problems with fundamental security settings in organizations. So this changes the requirements for what it means to operate as a federal agency. It also changes the requirements for what that means to interact with that federal agency, which in turn means that vendors become really attracted to building solutions that are more intrinsically secure to meet those needs, right? And we normalize user behavior around all of that. So this is a really powerful tool for us to use, right? And it also has a synergistic effect.
I don't think I've ever heard of the GRU as a collaborator in these
No, we work together.
before,
We work together all the time. Ask Tia, like all the time, right? Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
Fair enough. Okay, so the next one is the OpenID Foundation. So, the OpenID Foundation, the Connect working group there created a specification called OpenID Connect, and they wanted to foster adoption. It wasn't good enough to say you have OpenID Connect. They wanted to make it technically interoperable. So what they did is they created a very lightweight certification, self-attested, you do the work, you attest to it, but then you get to advertise. You get to say that you're part of this certification chart. And what that did is created this amazing virtuous cycle, because the vendors wanted to be on the chart. They may not have wanted to be interoperable, ironically, but they wanted to be on the chart. And what it also did is it gave customers a thing to ask for, right? They didn't have to say, you should be secure, because how amorphous is that? They can say, you need to match this profile, right? So all of a sudden, words have power, right? That's all you need to ask for.
All right, this one's very close to my heart, as is our keynote presenter about this subject. Ian is also close to my heart. A great person who gave a great presentation on how Salesforce moved towards mandating MFA. And we have also done a similar thing where we have this thing called security defaults where we require multi-factor auth and disallow certain protocols and a few other settings by default for all new organizations, and now we're starting to do it for existing organizations. And there's an interesting difference, right? Ian described this top-down mechanism by which it was declared, and then the whole organization had to react, and then customers had to react, and it was pushed down. In our organization, is one of my colleagues who came up with the idea and actually incubated it from within the team, and then actually grew it as sort of a grassroots thing, but is now impacting the whole company. Both of these things had the same net result, though. They both required a ton of executive sponsorship. That had to be one. And they both have created profound change in terms of security posture for like lots and lots and lots of people, like hundreds of millions of people. So it's been a very effective thing, and I think that the key is that hopefully that this kind of example can help bring more and more people into this. It's okay to mandate secure posture. It's okay to put our customers in that place. From our experience, I will say, and I think Ian described the same sort of stuff, it is not easy, right? Every business owner is terrified. Like, no, my customers are going to run away, right? Every organization is, no, my help desk calls are going to go off the charts, right? So it takes a certain amount of stick-to-itiveness, but the end result, I think, is well worth it.
Stick-to-itiveness.
That's a good word.
It's a good word. I like that word. All right, and so the last one is something that you all in here might be really familiar with, right? In 2005, one person wrote a blog entry that actually had a massive impact on our industry, and it was called the 7 Laws of Identity. And at the time, there was a whole bunch of schism going on. There was a ton of uncertainty. And what Kim did by writing this blog is he put words to a very simple set of ethical practices, and he essentially weaponized those words so that a customer could come in and say, dear vendor, aren't you violating the law of pluralism, right? Or aren't you, a regulator can say, hey, you need to adhere to these things. And the reason why is because they conform to Kim's blog, right? So he wrote that thing. It had a massive impact. It also went a long way to, cementing him as one of the, leaders of our time in identity. And yeah, it's not a bad side effect if you can pull it off.
Mildly influential. All right, so a few recommendations for, creating revolution. One of them is, if you're going to look at trying to create legislative change, I think, again, we had some success kind of riding a wave out of the attacks of late 2020. But a lot of my experiences actually comes from advocacy for a different cause. My son is a cancer survivor, and so I advocated a bunch for pediatric cancer legislation. And so things that we found worked, and I believe work universally, and people who are activists will tell you these things. Try not to get your ego into it. You don't need the thing to have your own name. There are organizations that care about what you care about. Putting your muscle behind them is more effective than creating your own thing. So create power, don't divert it, right? Find advocates. Create noise, find advocates. Find people that will join your cause, build your community, and importantly, find people in the halls of power that share your values. So for us, that was looking up and figuring out every senator and congressman who had had a family member impacted by pediatric cancer, and then getting those people on board. And it was those people that created the legislation at the end of the day. And we did get the legislation passed. And then agitation, finding ways to create visibility, sometimes uncomfortable visibility, right? Getting the press involved, making sure that people are getting calls from their constituents and being told, hey, I care about this, make sure it happens, right? So all those things help. Every legislator has a million, if you've ever gone and lobbied, like every legislator just has one person after the other coming through the doorway, right? And they're all different causes. How do you get your cause to bubble up to get action, right?
Right, so oops.
That was a lot of slides fast.
That was a lot of slides fast. I'm not that good. Although that's probably closer to us finishing on time, but whatever. We won't talk about that. So on the commerce side, this is actually a place where a lot of us have power, right? But we have to be creative with our power. So, money, contracts, relationships. Even, you might be very far away from your procurement, but you might actually be able to dictate login policies, for example, for your supply chain, for your partners, right? So think about how you could possibly add friction or recognize friction, more likely, where there is risk. Risk is cost. And that's the lesson that we sometimes forget, right? Risk is cost. And so if you can make it cheaper to be safe, right? If you recognize safe practices and it saves money, then that's valuable. If the safer way is the frictionless way, right? Whatever you have to do to organize that can work. And so an example of this, there was a healthcare provider I worked with years and years ago. they were brilliant, right? They were onboarding applications for single sign-on, and they had a 7-step plan for what you had to do as an application before they were going to turn on federation for you. Well, guess what? You could skip 3 of the steps. Like, you didn't have to fill it out, no paperwork, piece of cake, if you had already done the LDAP integration in advance, right? That was what they wanted. They wanted people to have the LDAP setup done in advance before the federation could occur. Boom, just like that. You would not believe. People were gaming the system, right? They were making their lives easier by making sure that they could skip those 3 steps, and everybody won. The other one is community. So I was searching for Happy Tornado. This is what I wanted in this picture. I don't know. That was the best I could do. I'm not sure it quite worked out. But yeah, but community is this, right? Community is us. We are all going to go home, and we are going to be aligned on what we talk about, right? Twitter, blogs, out loud, in public conversations, arguments, right? All of these things actually start to align people. They start using the same words. They start talking about the same things, right? And that's really what standards do, right? Standards are all about solving a business problem in the same way. And what that allows us to do is ask for a standard instead of having to describe an entire business use case, right? And not only that, it gives the power for a customer to go to their vendor and say, hey, if you implement this for me, you'll be able to use it for every single one of your customers. It's not a one-off ask. It's not proprietary, right? So there's an economy there. Again, it's actually better to adhere to the standard than to go create something as a one-off. And the other piece is, right, this fits in with everything. All of the foundations you see here and more are foundations formed for the purpose of alignment, for the purpose of having a larger voice than any one organization or any one person. Almost all of these organizations have individual memberships. So even if your company cannot afford to join, you have options here. You can, again, use your sweat, or you can use your money, right, to help these organizations speak with your voice. I cannot encourage that more highly.
All right, one more quick thing is these forces are not independent, they are synergistic. So if you think about, for example, the community of people who advocated the government to pass the cyber EO, which then turned into a financial incentive for people to get in line, right, for vendors to support that. That's a good example of, a synergy. And so those synergies are super, super important.
Absolutely. And of course, we still need the posters. Like, those are the fun parts, right? Adding the human element in is important. But just like for me when I started with my password manager, if you've taken the first step, it's so much easier to see the value in all of the additional rationalizations, right? So that's what we want to do. If we have to kick people a little forward, right, and then tell them why it's important, and then move them a little forward and tell them why it's important, right? That combined cycle can be really, really powerful.
All right.
And I think that's really what the conclusion that we want to leave with you, and we hope, we're very interested in your feedback on this, is that it's the creativity now that we need, right? We're not just bashing people over the head. We need to find ways to move them that make them happy, right? We need to find ways to start them in the right position, right? And then, it's much harder for them to slide. So we can do that, and we can do it all together, and this is how it starts, is with all of us thinking about it together. So thank you.
All right. Thank you all.
Appreciate it. And we have a few minutes for questions, I think.
Do we have another presenter coming?
Or stories? Anyone?
Stories? Cats?
Oh, in that case, we have time for beer.
Yeah, we were between you and beer, so.
Yes. All right. Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot.